Well, hello, everyone. And today I'm delighted to have as guest for the Dakini Conversations podcast, episode 8, Professor Peter Singer. Considered by many to be the founder of the modern animal welfare movement, he was recently named one of the most influential people in the world by Time magazine. For people who know about philosophical thinking on animal rights, eating animals, the question of sentience and value, Singer needs no introduction. And he was recently named one of the most influential thinkers in the world. He is also an Australian philosopher and professor of bioethics and has contributed to more than 50 books in over 30 languages. Singer is also founder of the Life You Can Save nonprofit. I first came across Singer's ideas a few years ago before I became a Buddhist while a philosophy postgraduate student in London, and I was studying his works on animals and ethics. It was groundbreaking and inspiring, like reading The Female Eunuch by Germaine Greer, another influential Australian thinker. And I agreed with everything he wrote about animals and our lack of respect and care for them when treating them, particularly as food for humans. Shortly after reading that, I became a vegetarian. So having the chance to meet and interview Singer is like a dream come true. It is difficult to do justice to the breadth and scope of Singer's influence in the world of animal rights and liberation, but his ideas have also been provocative, to say the least. After becoming a vegetarian at Oxford University and during a visiting professorship at New York University, he wrote what would become one of his most influential works, Animal Liberation, A New Ethics for Our Treatment of Animals in 1975. In this groundbreaking book, Singer challenges the speciesism of human beings who kill animals to eat, stating that if we did the same thing to humans with a similar level of consciousness or sentience, people would and do strongly object. That eating animals is just a form of human speciesism, which has no rational or even hedonistic justification. In 1999, after teaching at New York University, Singer became a professor at Princeton University. This appointment was protested by people who objected to his views on euthanasia. In 2009, Singer wrote the first edition of The Life You Can Save to demonstrate why we should care about and help those living in global extreme poverty and how easy it is to improve and even save lives by giving effectively. In 2018, Singer also co-founded the Open Access Journal of Controversial Ideas, along with bioethicist Francisca Minerva and moral philosopher Jeff McMahon. Now, nearly 50 years on, Singer has also published a revised version of Animal Liberation entitled Animal Liberation Now. Singer also recently entered into a discussion of Buddhist ideas and ethics with a Taiwanese Buddhist nun, who is a leading advocate for animal rights and a key figure in the Buddhist gender equality. Venerable Shih Chao-hwei, in the publication of their new book, The Buddhist and the Ethicist, Conversations on Effective Altruism, Engaged Buddhism, and How to Build a Better World. So, without further ado, welcome to Dakini Conversations, Professor Peter Singer.
Thank you, Adele. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I wanted to just cover a little bit of biographical background about your family and how you came into sort of vegetarianism and animal rights. So in your biography, it states that you're from a Jewish family who came from Austria and who escaped to Melbourne and to escape the Nazi occupation there. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about your experience of being from such a background and also of the impact of that religious background on your own upbringing, if any.
The impact of the religious background is easy to answer.
Yes.
Nil. My parents were not religious.
Right.
The Nazis regarded them as Jews because they were of Jewish descent, but neither of them was religious. I think my father went to synagogue twice a year, but probably mainly to meet people. And my mother never went at all. We didn't observe any dietary restrictions at all. We ate pork or bacon or whatever else it might have been. And when I was about to turn 13, my parents asked me if I wanted to have a bar mitzvah. My cousin was having a bar mitzvah. I wasn't interested and never had one. So there was really no religion in our household growing up.
Okay.
And in fact, basically there still isn't, I would say, although I know we're going to talk about Buddhism later on.
Yes. Yeah.
But I suppose there was something in the background about being the child of immigrants, and also, of course, knowing that, excuse me, and also, of course, knowing that although my parents and my mother's sister and my father's brothers had escaped the Nazis and come to Melbourne. Sadly, their parents had not. It was quite a typical story that the older generation thought they had too much to lose, that they could no longer make a new start in a new country. They didn't know the language. And all four of my grandparents were deported to the east, to my mother's parents to Theresienstadt, an overcrowded and underfed Jewish ghetto in what's now the Czech Republic, and my father's parents to the city of Lodz, where there was also a ghetto, and they were simply murdered, as people were at some time after that. They were murdered with carbon monoxide in the back of trucks. My mother's father died in Theresienstadt from the many diseases that were going around there. But my mother's mother survived, and she did come out to Australia around the time I was born. So I knew her, but I knew that, I'd lost three of my grandparents and many other relatives of my families gone as well.
And also interesting to read that your maternal grandfather, David Ernst Oppenheim, who collaborated with Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, was murdered in a Nazi concentration camp, and he wrote a joint article with Sigmund Freud, and you later wrote a biography about him. Is that right?
Yes, a biography as far as I could from the sources that I had available.
Yes.
And in a way, a somewhat personal. Some people call it a memoir, though of course I never knew him, so it wasn't really a memoir. But I was interested. He was of my grandparents and of my family. He was the one who had been most academic, in the sense that he had written articles published in journals, and he had and there was a book, a collection of his articles. So I was interested in trying to understand his ideas, whether I could trace any connections between his views and mine, and that's why I explored that and wrote that book.
And, the reason I ask also about this is obviously, you're very well known for being what's called an ethical sort of philosopher, who, specialized particularly in ethics. And I just wondered, as a young person, the impact of that sort of the Nazi genocide and what happened to members of your own family, how that sort of affected you in terms of your own thinking on moral philosophy, but also, was that something that led you to want to study ethics at university as you did?
I don't think it really led me to study ethics, because originally when I applied to go to university, I applied to do law. And I was more or less talked into combining law with an arts degree on the basis of the fact that I'd done well in humanities subjects in my final exams at high school. But I was, there was no philosophy taught in high schools then in Australia. So, I was interested in history and literature. And it was only an accident that I took philosophy, because my older sister was going out with somebody who'd taken philosophy and talked about it, and it sounded interesting and a bit different. But no, I couldn't say that it was something particularly to do with my background.
Okay. And so did you sort of feel any sort of the sense of moral outrage, though, that certainly was present?
Oh, there was certainly an outrage against what the Nazis had done, obviously,
Yes.
and that channeled itself, on the one hand, I think, into authoritarian, brutal, thuggish rule,
Yes.
which the Nazis clearly practiced, and I suppose admiration for democracy and civil discourse, non-violence, not absolute non-violence in the sense of being a pacifist, but in thinking that you had to curb violent riots in the streets and attacks on people and so on. That was, in a way, how the Nazis got going. So that, and also, of course, an abhorrence of racism.
Yes.
That's clear. And I did actually, my interest in history was to a large extent in 20th century European history, to try and understand what had happened there.
Well, let's turn to your going to university then. So you went to Oxford University.
That was my graduate work. I first went to the University of Melbourne.
Sorry, you first went to the University of Melbourne, but then you did your postgraduate at Oxford University. And you describe what happened there in terms of being one of the most formative experiences of your life, which is when you had decided to become a vegetarian. And, perhaps you could just say a little bit about that, because up until that point, I'm assuming then you'd been brought up as a meat eater.
Yes, absolutely, as most Australians were, of course.
Yes.
And I never really thought of animals as raising a serious issue. I was, obviously being at university during the 60s, you could not, well, you would have had to be very apathetic to not get involved in political and ethical issues, especially the Vietnam War, where Australia was one of the staunchest allies of the United States and had troops serving in Vietnam, and we introduced conscription to support those troops. So I was an active campaigner of the war against, active campaigner in the protest against the war in Vietnam and against conscription. I was also, as already mentioned, very much opposed to racism and advocate of social justice. But I never really thought of animals at that time as raising an ethical issue that was worth taking seriously. I thought of it, as many people did, as something for animal lovers, for people who love to have cats and dogs and maybe horses around them. But that was not me. I was never particularly an animal lover. So it was a quite dramatic change when I had lunch with a Canadian student who was a vegetarian. And that was very unusual to meet a vegetarian, especially a vegetarian who didn't come from India and had the sort of similar kind of educational, cultural background to me. And yet he didn't eat meat. Why not? What's his problem with meat? Basically, I asked him that, and he simply said that he didn't think it was right to treat animals the way they were being treated in order to being turned into the meat that I was, as this was a lunchtime conversation, that I was that very moment eating. And so I started exploring that more, and I sort of thought, well, why not? Don't they have good lives outside in the field, protected from predators? There's a regular supply of food. They won't starve. And then, yes, of course, they get trucked off to slaughter. That's a bad day for them.
Yes.
But no, I learned from the student Richard Keshen and from Ruth Harrison's book Animal Machines, which was the only book then written about factory farming. I learned that many of these animals were leading miserable lives, crowded indoors, crammed into sheds in conditions totally unsuitable for their basic needs.
Yes, exactly. And so something obviously moved you about that conversation, which, hadn't struck you before. And so it seems like one of the key things, particularly in your writing, which we'll talk about now, is this idea of speciesism. So now the term speciesism, apparently you didn't coin that phrase. Is that correct?
I did not. It was coined by Richard Ryder, who was another person in Oxford at that time.
Okay.
Someone who was very concerned about animal experimentation, and later wrote a book called Victims of Science. And I got the term from a leaflet that he had put out, which had a picture of a chimpanzee looking very ill. And this chimpanzee had been infected with syphilis as part of research on syphilis in humans. And just had this little one word above it, speciesism. And it was given to me after I had this conversation with Richard Keshen, and I talked to him and a couple of his other Canadian friends about the way we treat animals. And it suddenly struck me that this was what was going on. That just as we're familiar with racism and deplored it, and sexism was starting to be talked about by then. So we had this bias or prejudice in favor of humans against non-human animals, against other species, which had paid no regard to the amount of that they were suffering, or it was just the fact that they were not members of our species, just discounted their suffering almost entirely, unless of course there were these animals that we particularly loved, and that's where the animal lover bit of it came in, like the dogs and cats. But we didn't love chickens, we didn't love pigs, so we could lock them up in these dark sheds and give them miserable lives if that made it cheaper to eat the chicken and pig.
Exactly. And one of the things we'll get onto as we go through this discussion is also, some of the parallels between sort of sexism, but even also the parallels that have been drawn between the genocide and what we do to animals in factory farms. But for now, I just wanted to mention that from the Buddhist perspective, which you're probably aware of as well, is that the Buddha, in a way, was the first thinker and philosopher, in a way, to expose speciesism, in that he was very much, in his teachings, extended equal value and consideration to animals. And he also stated in many sutra teachings that we should not deliberately kill or eat animals, other than in what he called sort of very extreme cases, like you're starving or, you're very, very sick. But even then, he actually totally forbid it for Buddhist monastics and said that even when it's offered to them, when they're begging, they should only accept it if they've checked that the animal has been killed deliberately or not for food. So in a way, it's interesting because my background is more in the Buddhist philosophy, but when I read about speciesism, it struck me as a sort of a fundamental tenet of the Buddha's teachings. So I wondered if, you haven't, it doesn't seem like you've had up to now maybe some sort of background in Buddhism, but were you aware that Buddha himself had taught that sort of thing?
Well, not at the time that I met Rishikesh for lunch and discovered that I really hadn't thought about animals as an ethical issue.
Yes.
I then started reading fairly widely in the field of thinkers about animals. And so then I became aware that this was part of the Buddhist tradition. That's certainly true. Although I was also aware that people in countries that call themselves Buddhist eat meat, right? And
Yes.
there
Well,
isn't, it's not like most people in Thailand or Sri Lanka are vegetarians.
yeah,
So there was this sort of puzzle, was this,
it's very
maybe this
puzzling.
was
Yeah.
like what Jesus said about, you should basically give to the Good Samaritan who you need it, and the poor would be the first, and it was as hard for a rich man to go to heaven as for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. I mean, there's a lot of people who call
Think so,
themselves
yeah.
Christians who take no notice of these sayings, and it seemed
Absolutely.
that was the way Buddhism was too in that respect. But certainly
Yeah.
it's admirable that Buddha came out with these ideas many centuries really before you can find them elsewhere.
Yes, and before mass factory farming, which obviously has a massive impact on the environment as well. So now let's just return to your book then, Animal Liberation, which is an extremely influential and highly regarded book in terms of putting, right at the forefront the idea of animal rights and equality for animals. Now, one of the issues that people took with your thinking was the way that you then kind of developed this idea, and the idea that, the people who have sort of intellectual disabilities, or people or sort of embryos who have maybe a lesser or equal sentience to some of the animals that are routinely killed in slaughterhouses, could somehow then it would be following that rationale, following that logic, if you like, of the meat eaters, could then justifiably be terminated or killed, right? So that was where people really got upset, right? Would you say? Because they didn't sort of see that. I mean, for me, I thought it was quite clear. You were logically following the argument of a meat eater and saying, well, if you can logically justify killing a pig, which is the third most intelligent animal on the planet, apparently, you can then, obviously, you should be able to justify, if we're not being species, euthanasia for people who are, have intellectual disabilities, or even embryos, right?
Right. Well, let's go back to how this argument came into the discussion
Yes.
of animal liberation and how we should treat animals. When you say, as I've said, and Richard Ryder said, and you seem to agree, when you say our treatment of animals is based on speciesism, it's based on a prejudice against beings who are not members of our species, the most common response you get, at least from thinking people who don't just say, well, I like my steak and I don't care what you're saying. The most common response from thinking people is, no, it's not that they're not members of our species. It's because they're not rational, or they're not self-aware, or they're not autonomous. And philosophers of the past have said this too. Immanuel Kant says this: we have no duties towards animals because they are not autonomous beings. So the obvious reply to that is, Well, if you think that beings that are not self-aware or not rational or not autonomous don't have any rights, then it should follow that if we wanted to eat human beings, then when there are human beings who lack rationality or autonomy, we could eat them. We could fatten them up and eat them, or more practically speaking, we could do experiments on them in the way we do with animals. And that, really would be more useful, because we've been misled by a lot of experiments on animals because they are different from us, and drugs that might be useful for us might poison animals, or vice versa, drugs that seem safe for animals. So, but if you could experiment on humans, you would eliminate that problem anyway. But of course, everybody is horrified at the idea that you would do these experiments we do on animals on humans, and they're even more horrified at the idea of fattening them up and using them for food.
Yes.
So my point is simply, well, if that's your attitude, and I'm not obviously I'm not going to disagree with that attitude,
Yeah.
but if that is your attitude, then you can't really claim that it's not speciesism. You can't claim it's because animals are not rational, because here are these humans, some of whom are no more rational or clearly less rational than some of the
Yes.
animals we eat.
Yes, and I always felt that the people's reaction to that was more of a sort of kind of a knee-jerk, sort of quite superficial reaction to what I always felt was that you were just following through a logical argument that would follow if people were saying that, the reason, like you say, for justifying eating animals, if that was followed through to its logical conclusion and applied to humans, that would be the scenario, right? So I always felt that you had been portrayed unfairly in that respect, and still are, But anyway, so let's move on now to sort of some of the, like you mentioned yourself, some of this kind of disconnect, even now, between people who say they are Buddhists or people who say they care about animals or the environment and their dietary habits. So, for example, as you mentioned, in Thailand, but also many male religious leaders, such as the Dalai Lama, justify eating animals for health reasons. And thus, they encourage others to do the same. And now he has been criticized for this because it's actually not in accordance with the Buddhist teachings. There's nowhere that Buddha says you can eat it for health reasons, animals for health reasons. And also in the other world religions like Islam, Christianity, and as far as I'm aware, Judaism, they don't seem to take issue with eating murdered animals either. So nonetheless, there are examples of great Tibetan Buddhist masters who were and are strict vegetarians, even in high altitude Tibet, where plant food is minimal. Why? Okay, so a lot of the world's religions, they preach love and compassion, and in particularly Buddhism, the Buddha actually specifically taught people not to eat murdered animals and forbid it for the monastics. So why is there still this huge moral, sort of empathetic disconnect? And having been in Southeast Asia myself recently, everywhere I went, it was almost impossible at times to find a night market or a restaurant where you could actually get vegetarian options. So is it that it's just kind of really just forced on people a lot to eat meat still?
I'm not sure that it's forced on people. I think it's possible that people actually like it, and maybe there are evolutionary reasons why
Yeah.
they like it. Maybe, meat is a concentrated source of nutrients, and in times when food was scarce and it was hard to get enough to eat or hard to get enough protein to eat, the people who had a taste for it and ate it survived and reproduced to an extent that others didn't. So I think that's a factor, that it is relating to food. But religions in general, in my view, are, even if they start out with noble ideas, they're very prone to corruption. And as I said, we see that in Christianity in terms of assistance for the poor, and we see it in Buddhism in terms of the noble ideas of having compassion for all sentient beings, but the practice, which is so much less than that. And that's a real pity. And with regard to what you said from the Dalai Lama, even if it were true in the Buddha's day that under some circumstances, maybe you would need to eat meat to be healthy. There are so many alternatives available today, and especially to somebody in the position of the Dalai Lama, it's kind of absurd to say that he needs to eat meat to be healthy.
Well, I'm afraid to say I do have to agree with you on that. And of course, India, the Dalai Lama is based in India, and India traditionally, and even now, is, as you know, it's been a predominantly vegetarian country for many years because of the yogic tradition and the Hindu tradition, which also bans the selling and eating of cow meat, for example. So there's a whole tradition in India, and obviously they would take issue with that whole idea that you need to eat meat for protein. As one Indian kind of teacher, Sadhguru, says, he says, this is nonsense that you need, animal meat, you need protein from meat. He said, this is nonsense. And in India, for centuries, they've shown that to be the case. So anyway, that's a whole other debate. But yes, I think that there is this question mark about why people in India or in countries where there is an abundance of plant food still feel the need to eat murdered animals. Yeah, I think this is a question that, I think is important to ask. Now, let's move on to something then, which is related to, we're talking about sort of Nazi genocide. Now, some people have drawn parallels between the animal genocide that's happening in mass factory farms and the Nazi genocide. Some people agree and some people strongly disagree. What's your view on that?
No, it's not a comparison that I really make,
Yeah.
partly, I suppose, because I'm aware that it will seem very insensitive to people, and people including, like my parents and their friends with a similar background, that it seems to be comparing those the Nazis murdered, including my grandparents, with pigs or chickens. And, obviously there are obvious differences there, whatever you think about the role of intelligence or reflection. There's clearly a different kind of awareness about your life, about your future, about what you're losing if you realize that people are wanting to kill you or that they're killing others like you. So it's not the same, but I can see why people think that there are parallels. And it's interesting to me that the great Jewish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's no relation to me, made that comparison explicitly in one of his stories about a man who was actually a slaughterman, but who then starts to have thoughts about what he's doing. And he says something like, in relation to animals, all men are Nazis, and
Yes.
and it's an eternal Treblinka. Treblinka, of course, being the mass extermination camp where so many Jews were murdered. And you can see why. Yes, it's a mass process in the same way on an even larger scale to what we're doing to animals. And even if you don't actually make the direct comparison, we're clearly just thinking of them as things, as units for consumption, as machines for converting grain into flesh, and not as individual sentient beings.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess someone who is making that comparison would say, well, pigs, who are extremely intelligent animals, have families. They are aware when they're in those slaughterhouses that they're waiting to be killed, right? They say that animals see other animals being killed there. So I don't know. I mean, some people would say that, there is the comparison there. And again, it's just a form of speciesism not to accord the animals that sort of equal value, right? But anyway, that's another debate there as well. But let's move on to the environment now then, because as in the time of the Buddha, there weren't these mass factory farms, and certainly they seem to be on the increase. Certainly the meat diet seems to be everywhere still. People in the restaurants where I go, it's still kind of predominantly meat options. So the environmentalist Jonathan Safran Foer says in his book Eating Animals that one cannot be an environmentalist and eat meat or eat slaughtered animals. So what's your view on that? How much does the sort of environmental issue impact your ideas now? So when you wrote Animal Liberation, it was particularly about the sentience of animals. What about the environment?
Yes, I think it is an additional reason for avoiding meat. And last year I published a book called Animal Liberation Now, which fully updates animal liberation and adds quite a lot of new material. And some of the new material is about the environmental impact of factory farming, and especially with regard to climate change, because that's a major reason for preferring a plant-based diet. So I think it's obviously it wasn't a causal factor for me at the time. I became vegetarian entirely because of thinking that it's wrong to treat animals in the way that we do, wrong for the animals. But I now realize, and I started to learn in the 1980s and 90s, that it's not only fossil fuels that are causing climate to change, but it is meat patterns of meat consumption, and particularly, I suppose, the consumption of a very large amount of beef and dairy products, because it's the cattle who are the biggest producers of greenhouse gases. So the growth of the number of cows in the world, thanks to human production and desire to eat them, has been a major factor and still is a major factor in contributing to climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before we go on to your other one of your other very influential essays about giving and poverty, I just want to say, because there does seem to be still a reluctance by huge amounts of the general public to really engage with this whole issue of, its connection to climate change. And for example, some people have said there need to be stronger methods to encourage or even stop people eating such huge amounts of meat. For example, Paul McCartney said all slaughterhouses should have glass walls. And but then another writer who's written about carnism, which is basically the addiction to meat and how people find it very, very difficult to abandon it. So what do you think can really sort of move people? Is it going to have to be a government thing, which is led by the government to sort of make it extremely expensive or highly taxed, or because it doesn't seem to be on the decrease? Yeah.
No, globally it's not on the decrease, and that's partly because of Asia and the fact that countries like China have become more prosperous, and when they're more prosperous, people are spending more money on meat, and so the amount of meat consumed in China, and therefore the number of animals in factory farms in China, has skyrocketed over the last 20, 30 years. And so there's definitely more factory farming now in the world than there was in 1975 when I published Animal Liberation. And that's a tragedy. But it's not everywhere. There are some European countries where meat consumption is falling. I think Germany is one and Sweden is another. And it probably is a concern for the contribution of meat to climate change that is playing a big role there, as well as, I think, the concern for animals and understanding about factory farming. So what do we need to do about it? Yeah, I think we do need to tax all products, in fact, in accordance with their contribution to climate change. And if we do that, of course, we will tax fossil fuels heavily. And to some extent, we're already doing that through emissions quotas. But we will also have to start taxing meat, and meat from ruminant animals, the beef and mutton, will be the heaviest tax because they have the largest emissions per kilo of meat.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So let's learn that often quoted essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, and what's called the drowning child thought experiment, because this is another topic that you're considered to be highly influential on, is the question of extreme poverty. And that you say, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And you then also wrote a book called The Life You Can Save Later, and talking about what's called effective altruism. And you argue that citizens who are affluent nations are actually behaving immorally if they do not act to end the poverty they know that is existing in developing nations. And this is where the drowning child argument also comes up, right? So I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit and your view on that.
Yes, certainly. So what I wanted to argue there is that it may be wrong not to do something to help people, even if you're not in any way responsible for the fact that they need help. So obviously everyone would say, you know, if you carelessly hit a pedestrian by driving badly, you are the one who must stop and call the ambulance and do everything you can to help that person get to hospital. That's quite obvious. But people were saying that global poverty is not their responsibility. And I wrote this in the light of the particular crisis that developed in Bangladesh in 1971, when it wasn't called Bangladesh, it was called East Pakistan, and it was part of Pakistan. But after some elections there that had elected a party that was seeking independence from Pakistan for what is now Bangladesh, the Pakistani army brutally repressed all of those who'd advocated for independence, and 9 million people fled over the border into India. And I was in Oxford at the time as a graduate student. And, you know, again, there was this attitude, well, yes, this is a bad thing. You know, we could throw a few coins in a tin if it's rattled under our nose on the high street. But it's not our responsibility. We didn't cause this problem. It's, you know, the Pakistan government or something like that. And they're the ones who should look after these people. Or but that seems to me wrong. If we have the opportunity, as you read in that passage, if we have the opportunity to do something that is really important for somebody, like save their life or dramatically improve their condition, and we can do so by, I don't know, whatever it might be, not updating our mobile phone for another year, or not going so often to cafes and paying $5 or $6 for a cup of coffee that you could make at home for pennies. Well,
Yes.
you know, those are things that we should be doing, I want to argue. And how could I show that? Well, I wanted to have this little example of walking past a shallow pond in which you see a child drowning. And although, you know, it's a small child, so you would expect the parents there to be running, jumping into the pond and rescuing their child, but there's nobody else there. You don't know why there's nobody else there, but here is this child drowning, apparently about to drown in the pond. There are you in the park, nobody else around. You can easily, and at no risk to yourself, save the child. You know that the pond is quite shallow. But there is a cost, and the cost is that you have to run and jump in right now, and you're wearing really expensive shoes and maybe some other clothes, and they're going to get ruined. And so you'll be up for, you know, a significant amount of money in a way, but nothing that's going to really change your lifestyle at all if you have to replace those things. Or, you know, you could just walk past the pond and forget about the child, who, after all, you're not responsible for the child's situation. But if you ask people, would that be wrong? Would it be wrong to say, I don't want to ruin my shoes, so I'll let the child drown? Everybody, except, you know, one. If I ask this to an audience of 200 or 300 people, there's sometimes one contrarian, but everybody else says, of course it would be wrong. It would be awful.
Yes.
You know, you can't let a child drown because you don't want to have to replace your shoes. So I agree, of course, with that. But if that's so, then does it really matter that the child is in a pond in front of you rather than that the child is in a remote country? If you know that there's an organization that'll take your donation and will use it to save the life of a child who would otherwise die, that seems pretty similar to me as so not doing that, or not giving something anyway. There's a question about how much, but not giving something reasonably significant to help people in extreme poverty just seems to me to be incompatible with living a truly ethical life in the situation in which we are now, in which we can so easily help people in extreme poverty.
Yes. Yes, I think what you're saying makes sense. I guess some people would sort of counter argue and have probably that, you know, is the proximity, right? So some people might say, because the thing with giving money, there's an idea in Buddhism which they call idiot compassion. I don't know, have you heard of this expression?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, well, it's a kind of it's a Buddhist idea. It's where basically it's because, you know, when Buddha taught, he said that, you know, compassion alone is not sufficient to live what he called an awakened life. So it's not a good life, it's an awakened life, which is slightly different from an ethical life. And so the factor that's missing with compassion alone is wisdom, right? So he would say that there are times when giving, just giving, for example, giving food or giving money, you know, in a temporary way, it would alleviate someone's poverty or starvation, let's say, and it's good for that. But a long-term basis, it would not, and it may even continue it because it's not dealing with the root causes of it. So he has this idea that, you know, many times people want to do the right thing, they give, but because it's not based in any wisdom, it becomes like an idiot compassion, and actually can even be counterproductive to what people are trying to achieve, right? And we all know this argument anyway, outside of Buddhism. People say, oh no, you shouldn't give to people begging on the street, you know, it would just intensify and continue their situation. So I just wondered if, you know, in relation to the drowning child argument, so some people might say, well, that's obvious. Yes, of course, you know, a pair of shoes is nowhere near comparable to a child's life. But give it, so am I right with this? The sort of thrust of your argument here is that it's actually immoral for people who are affluent, who have a lot of money, who are spending it on all sorts of things which aren't necessary, that they should be giving money, I'm assuming, for causes which are actually not that proximate to them. Is that kind of...
Well, I don't think that proximity is relevant. That's true. I don't think it matters whether the child is in front of you or 10,000 kilometers away.
Yeah.
But what does matter is whether you can be equally confident that you are saving a child's life, or that you are contributing to saving a child's life, and that you are not making the situation worse, because what you described the Buddha as saying is clearly very wise. There is no point in giving if you're going to make a situation worse. But fortunately, we now can be highly confident that helping somebody far away is possible, that we can give to an organization which has a strong track record of using donations wisely and using them to help people in great need, saving lives or transforming the lives of people in poverty. And so that idea, which goes under the general label of effective altruism, and you know, it to some extent it builds on the altruism of the article Famine, Affluence and Morality that contains the drowning child in the pond example, but it sorry. But it adds this idea of effectiveness, of the importance of making your donations be effective in doing as much good as you can. And as part of that effective altruism movement, there are groups that started doing research into which are the most effective charities to give to that will do the most good. And one of those, to some extent aggregating the research done by others, although it does do some of its own research, is the organization that I founded that spun off the book you mentioned, The Life You Can Save. And it's simply called The Life You Can Save, and anybody who wants to have a look at it can go to thelifeyoucansave.org. And we recommend about 20 charities who have been independently assessed as being highly effective, and therefore as not being idiot giving in that expression, but as being wise giving, where you can be confident that it is making a difference in a positive direction.
Yes, maybe I phrase it as an unwise compassion. I mean, it is commonly called idiot compassion, but yes, maybe in these politically correct times, I should say unwise compassion. But I think the idea is still there, that people often think that, you know, sometimes throwing money at a problem doesn't make it go away. And I think this is something that the Buddha himself, you know, 2,500 years ago was fully aware of even then, that he was just saying that, you know, the underlying roots of suffering, which is, I guess, what effective altruism is aiming at alleviating, right, is the suffering of other beings, is that it's kind of more temporary, because affluent people, in a way, yes, they can certainly give a lot more of their income to help people who are in very materially poor situations. But whether that in itself is ever going to actually deal with the root issue of suffering is a different issue, would you say, even for an ethicist who's not necessarily coming at it from a Buddhist perspective?
Well, there are many kinds of suffering and many different
Mm-hmm.
causes for these kinds of suffering. We've talked about the suffering of non-human animals, and factory farming is a major cause of that. And now we're talking about the suffering of people in extreme poverty, or parents who see their child die from malaria when a bed net could have saved that child's life. So I think there are things that money can do to reduce suffering, but to eliminate suffering, no, I think that's probably a utopian goal. But we could dramatically reduce suffering by getting rid of some of the worst and most extreme forms of suffering, and then there would still be suffering of various kinds. But I think it's it's not a question of, can we eliminate suffering and is
Mm-hmm.
all of this just drops in the ocean unless we do? I think
Yeah.
we're making a significant impact, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the statistics that are issued, say, by the World Bank on the number of people in extreme poverty, or by the United Nations Children's Fund on the number of children dying before their 5th birthday, most of those deaths are from poverty-related causes, you see dramatic progress. We are making progress. The number of people in extreme poverty rose a little bit during the pandemic because a lot of people lost their jobs, but it's going down again. And it's the number of children dying before their 5th birthday is now around half of what it was
Mm-hmm.
when I wrote the first edition of The Life You Can Save, which is not that long ago. I think it
Yeah.
was published in 2009. So the figures I had quoted there were probably 2008, and it was 9.8 million children. It's down to 5 million children now. So, we definitely are making progress. And those who say, oh, it's the structure, we can't
Mm-hmm.
get rid of poverty until we've overthrown the capitalist global economic order or something of that sort. Well, it's great to talk like that, but you have to say how we're going to overthrow the capitalist economic order, what we're
Yeah.
going to replace that with that will be so much better and will eliminate poverty.
Yes.
And meanwhile, we're actually, in 15 years, we've halved the number of people in extreme poverty without
Yes.
overthrowing the global
Yes.
economic order. So let's keep doing that. Maybe
Yeah.
we won't eliminate it. Maybe we'll get it down to a quarter of what it is or what it was rather than half. But that's millions of lives that we've saved.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I guess I'm just sort of, offering that as a potential counter argument. It's something that people will say that sometimes just giving money doesn't always sort of reduce it, but like you say, it can be very effective as well. And
Yeah,
certainly there's an issue. I think most people would agree 100% that there is an issue with sort of super rich or extremely affluent people who seem to have billions of dollars. Way beyond what's required of to lead a comfortable life, which was your essential point as well, right? That when you've got that kind of money beyond what's necessary like that, that you're saying it is kind of immoral, right, to hold on to that and not to share that. So would you advocate like a sort of a kind of a maximum income? Because some people have, suggested that to deal with this issue of the super rich.
if we had a single world government, maybe it could implement a tax on the super rich, but we don't. And if you tried to tax the super rich in one country, they will simply pick up and go to another country that has lower tax rates, and that other country will welcome them because even though its tax rates are low, they're super rich. So even a low rate of tax will bring that government in a lot of revenue. So I think it's futile really in the present world economic order or world political order, I should say, to talk about taxing the super rich. We could raise the tax somewhat, but we would have to work out the point at which it would simply drive them into the arms of some other country and not achieve anything really positive.
And I think again, this sort of now turning on to your latest publication now, as we're going into the sort of Buddhist views as well with your new book. And I think this is where people who are following Buddhist ideas would say, And that's why the way to address super rich is basically the fundamental root cause is greed, right? Or selfishness, or, only seeking one's own selfish desires and pleasures at the expense of everything or everyone else. And so that's where the changes need to happen, right? That, like you say, politically, it's very unlikely that's ever going to change, while sort of greed is still prevalent.
Well, I think culture can play a role here, right? If culture didn't accept, it's not so much the greed, it's the conspicuous consumption, the spending, on these super yachts that cost $200 million to build and $20 million a year to maintain. If we had a culture where that was considered a shameful thing to do, because that money could be doing so much good elsewhere in the world, then maybe it would change. I'm not sure that this kind of greed is really innate, or that it's, there may be a tendency that's innate, but I think it can be altered by cultural changes, as we've altered things like the acceptability of smoking indoors, right? I mean, when I was young, you went to a party and you came home and your clothes stank of cigarette smoke, even the next morning, because the rooms that you were in were filled with smoke. We've changed that. It doesn't happen.
And sexism and racism, as you say. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, certain things that would have been considered more acceptable then, in terms of how we speak about women or different races are now totally unacceptable, or at least, like you say, among a lot of people, socially unacceptable. But just briefly going into the Buddhist and the Ethicist. Now, this is your new book, Conversations on Effective Altruism, Engaged Buddhism and How to Build a Better World, with a Buddhist nun. Now, this is interesting because my background is in Buddhist philosophy particularly, but also for you, right? Because, and up until now, I don't think your work has been connected with Buddhism so much, has it? Or have I missed something?
No, you're quite correct. It is not.
So can you sort of explain a little bit about the background to, this book and this collaboration, and what you hope to sort of achieve by bringing in that sort of conversation with a Buddhist there?
Well, in her preface, I think Shih Chao-hwei says something like it was a meeting of minds. She uses the term. And I think that's exactly what happened. It began at a conference that I was invited to speak at in Taiwan about animals and animal welfare. And I found that the conference was run by an organization called the Life Conservation Association, of which Venerable Shih Chao-hwei was founder. And so I was interested in her and why she had founded this. And of course, there was a Buddhist background to it of the sort that you have already described. But she had many interesting thoughts on a lot of things. And we had a chance to talk because we went from Taipei to Hualien to meet a Buddhist master, Cheng Yen, there. And so we had a bit of time to talk and explore those similarities and differences, and realize that in some respects my secular utilitarian philosophy and her Buddhist philosophy converged. Not in all respects, but I thought it would be interesting to explore these differences at greater length, and perhaps to record a discussion that we have and then maybe write it up and publish it somewhere. So that's the origins of the book. It was not that I suddenly developed a new interest in Buddhism, but rather that I met a remarkable Buddhist woman who had a lot of interesting ideas that in some ways mirrored mine and in other ways didn't. And I thought it was worth exploring.
So dare I ask, is she a vegetarian herself?
She is, yes.
Okay, no, I say dare I ask because as we spoke about before, I've been in many Buddhist countries where many people who call themselves Buddhist still eat animals regularly, particularly in the Tibetan Buddhist community. But now this nun that you worked with, Shih Chao-hwei, I hope I got the pronunciation right there, but she's also working on sort of gender equality as well, right? So what now some people again have made parallels between the way women are objectified as flesh, as pieces of meat, for consumption, in sort of patriarchies and even in patriarchal religions, is very similar to the way animals are commodified and held up as pieces of meat to be consumed. In fact, I noticed on your latest Twitter post that you mentioned you've interviewed a woman who is an activist for animal liberation, who you said strung herself up kind of naked to kind of almost demonstrate that, right?
Exactly. Yes. That's
So
Ingrid Newkirk, the founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals.
yes, thank you. And now this is something that people have made this comparison before as well, even in the 70s, about the way that women are treated like pieces of flesh. So what's your view on that? And how can people sort of draw parallels then between how, and also racism, but particularly the sexual objectification of women as pieces of meat, like within the sex industry, or that they're just kind of there to be bought, consumed, and kind of, forgotten about.
Just before I answer that specific question, since you mentioned the interview with Ingrid Newkirk,
yes,
let me just say I'm starting a podcast,
yes,
which will launch, we plan on May the 16th, and in the first season, the interview with Ingrid Newkirk will be aired, and there are many other interesting interviews. The podcast is on Lives Well Lived, and Ingrid is a wonderful person who has used her life very effectively to reduce animal suffering as much as possible. She's a lively and amusing person. So I do recommend, if you want to look out for the podcast Lives Well Lived, that I made in starting in mid-May. But yes, the question, you're right, of course, that there is a kind of parallel between the objectification of women as flesh in the sexual sense, and the objectification of animals as flesh in the meat consuming sense. I think Carol Adams may have been the first to make that point in a book called The Sexual Politics of Meat, which is definitely still worth reading. And so Shih Chao-hwei was certainly a campaigner against sexism. And as she describes in one of the chapters of the book, the book's called The Buddhist and the Ethicist, by the way, she, when the Dalai Lama came to visit Taiwan, she and some supporters jumped up on the stage and unfurled banners which contain the rules that say that female Buddhist monastics, nuns, if you like, must be subordinate to monks, to male Buddhist monastics. And they held them up, and then they tore them in half in front of the Dalai Lama. So she was making the point that these rules still prevail, and she describes in the book how it's still quite difficult in places where there are both male and female monastics taking part in a ceremony. Usually the males go in first and the females follow afterwards, and so she's really engaged with that issue as well as with the issue of animals and with several other issues.
That sounds great. I mean, she's like the Sinead O'Connor in a way then of this. I mean, I wonder if she got sort of part of her inspiration from that. Maybe I have to interview her. I don't. It sounds.
You should,
sounds
definitely.
Very interesting.
You should. She would be very interesting.
Yeah. But when was that, by the way? Sorry, when she did that, when she unfurled those banners.
Oh, I'm afraid I think the year is given in the book, but it was not that long ago. I think it was in the 2000s anyway. But maybe it was 10 years ago or something like that. I'm guessing.
Yes, I mean, and sadly, I also recently wrote something which was saying that, there were no women at this global Buddhist conference in New Delhi last year. The whole main panel on the stage was all men. And even at the VIP dinner afterwards, at which the Dalai Lama was the guest of honor, there were no women around the table. So this is something I also noticed and wrote about. And it was kind of quite sad in a way that even now, 21st century, this seems to be very much still very male dominated. Now,
That's religion, though, isn't it? I mean, it's
well,
religions tend to be very conservative, you know. I mean, look at the Catholic Church. You know, there are no female bishops. There
yeah.
certainly isn't a female pope in sight. Um, you know,
But I think things are changing. I mean, I know from certainly things that people are trying to change things within in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. There's certainly some really great women who are really actively trying to do that. And I think that, we could go back to, again, the Buddha, because he was the first to really allow women in as a kind of equal part of the Buddhist Sangha, which was unknown of in India at that time, right? So they were, um, communities like the Hindu communities, women were kind of kept out of that. And so Buddha was quite a radical, they say he was quite a rebel in a way because he was going against all of that. He allowed women into the Sangha. He also gave an equal role to laymen and laywomen. It wasn't just monastics. So in that respect, I wouldn't say go to far say he's like a sort of progressive feminist, but certainly he was feminist for his time, I think, in terms
right.
of
Yeah.
yeah.
No, and I'm certainly not saying that it can't change. I'm just saying that religions seem to be slower to change than other aspects of society.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Now, as we're coming to the end of our conversation, I just wondered if you might have spare a few moments to share some of your thoughts with us about what's coming up with this. They're talking about AI and its effects on animals in slaughterhouses and using artificial intelligence to kind of do the jobs of humans. Do you have any thoughts to share with that? Is that something that you've written about or going to write about?
I have written about AI and animals, yes. I've written in particular with a Hong Kong-based Chinese called Fai. And we published an article. There's a journal called AI and Ethics. We published an article in that journal a year or so ago. And I've co-authored with a couple of other people, and there's more in the works.
Okay.
It's not particularly about AI in slaughterhouses. It's about AI in general. And I think the largest and most threatening aspect is AI in factory farms, again, because the numbers are so huge. And AI is being used to monitor animals in factory farms. And that in itself may not be a bad thing, but the concern is that it will make factory farms more efficient and cheaper and enable the producers to crowd the animals even more because the AI will pick up disease outbreaks earlier. So I do think it's a negative thing. But there are many other applications of AI, for example, in self-driving cars, where the AI has to be, asked to make a decision about will I hit this dog, or will I impose some slight risk to the passengers by braking hard. So yeah, I think AI in animals is a major issue that is developing.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like a sort of potential nightmare, even. I mean, it's nightmarish enough with humans in there, never mind machines controlling the show, right? I mean, it would, in a way, the empathy would become even less, even though it's probably the zero empathy at the moment. Anyway,
Yeah, let me just say that the empathy would be less, but the sadism would be less too.
well,
And there is
yes.
sadism in low paid or exploited workers. They sometimes just take it out on the animals.
Yeah, and this is something I also tried to bring out in something I wrote, which was the psychological impact of working in slaughterhouses themselves
Oh,
on
yes,
the workers,
absolutely.
right? Because this
Yeah,
is often
terrible.
forgotten about in the sort of vegetarianism, because there are humans working in those places, and like you say, they either become very, very sociopathic, sadistic, or they already were. But nonetheless, they say that there is a huge psychological impact on those people of being in those jobs, right? And I guess that's another area to perhaps to focus on. I know that the Buddha, he, for example, did say that even if there's this idea among Buddhists that you can eat animals as long as you didn't kill it, which again is a misrepresentation of what he taught. But the thing is with that is the Buddha also said that you shouldn't support wrong livelihoods. And one of the wrong livelihoods he listed was killing anything, killing animals
Right.
or humans. So you could say, well, by purchasing animals that have been killed, you're supporting that wrong livelihood. And that's another sort of way to come at it, right? Is a
Yes,
psychological impact.
absolutely. You're complicit in making it happen. I agree. I think that's completely right.
Yeah. Anyway, Peter Singer, it's been an absolute joy and pleasure, and as I say, a dream come true to interview you and for you to share your thoughts here today. And I'm sure many people who are perhaps not so much aware of your work, who are more familiar with, say, Buddhism, will be absolutely delighted to hear some of your ideas and what you say and read your books and your works. And so thank you very, very much for joining this conversation. And I wish you all the best with all your future projects and your books. And yes, the new book recommended for everyone is The Buddhist and the Ethicist, Conversations on Effective Altruism, which has been published this year. So many thanks again.
Thanks very much, Adele. It's been great talking to you. And if people do want to keep up with what I'm doing,
yes.
I have a website, petersinger.info, and I'm now on Substack. It's called Bold Reasoning with Peter Singer. And as I said, there will be a podcast out soon.
Brilliant. Okay. And I'll put links to all of that when I publish this podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.